G'day, this is Steve in Auckland, and I wanted to have a chat to you today about whether you should consider buying property in New Zealand as an expat. So obviously moving to a new country, especially from a Western country like Australia, Britain or the US, one of the things that is chief on your mind is whether you should actually get involved in the property market or not. So I'll give you my experience and you can take it from there. I guess probably the first thing I need to do is give you a little disclaimer to tell you that I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not registered to give you any sort of financial advice. So if you're looking for that, go and see a professional. This is solely my experience and opinion with dealing with the property market in New Zealand. Having said that, I actually work in the industry, so on the finance side, I have a pretty good view on what's going on in the market at any given stage and how that might impact you as a expat looking to shift to Auckland. Okay, first things first. The New Zealand property market is probably a little bit different to what you have experienced in the US. Look, I think the reality is the laws are a little bit different out here. You're always best to go and see a solicitor when you do the transaction, and make sure that the conveyancing, which is what we call the transferring process, is all correct. So that aside, should you buy property here? That's a difficult question to answer, but I guess the short version is no, not right now. New Zealand's experienced a huge run-up in property prices from about 2012 to 2017, 2018. We've experienced around about 50% growth in prices. We're literally at the top of our marketplace, and I don't think from an investment perspective there's much to be gained from doing a short-term buy right now. The actual cost of holding these properties, when you look at what you'd have to pay in mortgage with interest rates, how much money you actually have to stick into the property to secure the financing, it's just not worth it. The yield is terrible. So for instance, from an investment perspective, if you actually purchased a unit or a house out here, you're probably looking at a net yield of about 2 to 3%. That barely makes it worthwhile. And if you've got horribly high financing cost, that makes it worse. So my advice is, if you're looking to come out here and buy something and live in it for maybe 6 months or 12 months and then potentially flick it prior to moving off somewhere else, then the best advice is don't buy. It's actually, in the medium term, it is cheaper to rent, and you're probably not going to see much capital appreciation in the property price over the next 12 months. Having said that, it's an interesting case out here with property for more medium to long-term purchases. If you are looking to buy a house or an apartment and you're going to hold on to it for upwards of 5 years, it is very likely that you are going to be better off actually buying. And the reason is the New Zealand property market very much moves in cycles, and although we've hit the top of the peak right now, we're flattening off, if not declining slightly. If you held that for 5 years, you're still going to do really well. Property is a premier blue chip investment in this country. Most Kiwis view property as a better investment than shares or any other financial instrument. So this is the key thing. I mean, there's always demand for houses. And in fact, given what's gone on in immigration over here in the last sort of decade, there's always a shortfall in the amount of property that's available. So I don't see that going away anytime soon. There is always going to be upward pressure on prices here over the medium to long term. So if you're looking at buying a house to live in for at least 5 years, if not a little bit longer, go for it, spend some money, get a house or get an apartment. However, something you should be aware of, a lot of the build quality in this country is pretty bad. So there's a big issue with leaky homes, which is effectively homes that when it rains, there's water egress into the buildings. This is a huge issue over here. It's spawned heaps of court cases, and a lot of people have been stung buying into especially apartment buildings, and then finding out 2, 3, 4 years down the track that the remediation cost to fix it is in excess of $50,000 an apartment, And although you can sue the council for failing to do the inspection properly, and you can also sue the builder, it may take years and years and years, and you may never actually see enough money to completely cover the costs of fixing the issues. So that's something to be aware of, and look, I'll do a video in the future on how to deal with leaky buildings. But the reality is most of the really leaky buildings now are already known, and they actually mark it on the property title, what we call a limb. They mark it on the property title that it's a leaky building and it needs to be remediated. So that is something to consider. There's been a lot of shoddy building here, probably over the last decade. If you go back prior to around about 2000, anything built prior to 2000 was built really strongly and is very unlikely to be a leaky home. So that's definitely something to consider. And if you're buying a new build in any form, I would always recommend getting an engineer's report, and they can go around the walls with the little machine that measures for moisture, and that's something you should really absolutely do. Moving on to financing, most of the banks, there's 4 or 5 really big banks here as far as New Zealand goes. The costs of financing from a bank are quite reasonable. You're looking at sort of the 4.5% to maybe 5% interest rate. That's quite decent. In fact, HSBC's running rates at the moment, special deals at about 3.6% interest rate. So it's a really good deal for financing. The only thing is recently they've tightened up on bank regulation. So the deposit that you need to buy is pretty weighty. So you're looking at around about the 20% mark. You need 20% of the value of the home for a bank to look at lending to you. For those of you that have offshore sources of income, you're pretty well right if it's Australia, Britain, or the US. However, if you are one of my Chinese Asian viewers and you're looking to buy a house here, think again, because basically the banks are now no longer accepting any form of offshore income from Asian countries, even if they can get some sort of verification. And so this is largely due to a lot of the fraud that's gone on over the past couple of years. So be aware of that. Financing can be a bit tight. There is a non-bank finance sector where you can actually go along and get a loan from typically a short-term loan from a finance company at about sort of 3 to 4% above bank rates. However, there is some significant costs and charges involved in that. So, you really have to know what you're doing when it comes to dealing with a finance company. Whereas the banks with standard 30-year mortgages are pretty straightforward. I don't think it's all that costly, in fact, to do. So consider that. I think ultimately the best advice I can give you about buying out here, especially in Auckland, which is a city that's had the biggest run up in prices. Take your time, rent in 2 or 3 locations for a little while first, and see how you go. You will learn there's a completely different way that we run houses in this country from, say, the US. The lease terms are much shorter. The costs of moving in is a little bit higher, and I think the reality is that it's a bit of a minefield for somebody that's brand new in New Zealand and may not know what's going on in various suburbs. Having said that, if you do choose to buy, bring plenty of money. So Auckland in itself, the average house price now is well in excess of 900,000, which is just crazy. Absolutely crazy to spend $900,000 on a pretty basic house. And yes, it is Kiwi dollars, so you get that big exchange rate difference. However, it's still not cheap here compared to, for instance, when I go back to Texas and I see what you can buy property there for. Huge difference. So be aware of that. But it can be a good investment if you hold on to it long term. I've got friends that have bought inner city apartments, houses going back sort of 2012, 2013, and a lot of them have picked up a 40 and 50% gain. Those days are probably gone for a little while, so don't count on that. But property in New Zealand is always a good long-term investment because, in short, especially in the city here, Auckland, we've got limited land available. We are on an isthmus, and there's lots of bridges and a lot of very limited land until you move further south or further north. So there's going to have to be some intensification, more high-rise, more medium and low-rise building going on. So I think it's over the medium term, 5 years upwards, it's a good investment. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you'll see going around the city here at the moment is because the value of the land has just increased so much over the last 5 years, is they're starting to tear down older buildings, and they're really revitalising, especially the inner city area, as well as some of the suburbs, revitalising it with modern housing, modern apartment buildings, and away they go. So in fact, where I live here, right in the centre of the city, there's a huge big commercial tear down that's going on. I'll show you in a sec, actually just next to us, and it's been a massive tear down job, and it'll be a huge big block of land, and that's actually a hotel going on partially onto that block there, and also there'll be a residential housing and tenancies. So the value has really been there for development, and we are slowly catching up in New Zealand with spending money on infrastructure and modernising the housing stock. So I think probably in 5 to 10 years it'll actually be quite an interesting place to be, because it's in that transition between a very sort of folksy country town to a very, very modern city, and there's been a lot of work done. So actually I'll show you what that tear down has looks like. So take a look at this. So you can see it's a huge deconstruction site, and it's going to be interesting when we see the big hotel go up. So you can see there's a fair bit of high-rise property just around me here. So there you go. All right, I'll put you back down. Yeah, so hopefully that's been a little interesting for you today, and communicated a bit of info on the housing market. Probably in closing, the one thing I would say is be a bit careful about buying apartments in the very centre of the city here, because as you can see, there's a lot of stock going up. So we could see a bit of a glut in the future just on that sort of type of housing. But yeah, that's it. It's Steve in Auckland. Thanks very much for watching. Please subscribe and like the video, and hopefully I'm sort of working towards trying to get 100 subscribers. So if you want any content actually covered, I can talk about pretty well anything to do with New Zealand at this stage. Just post a comment, and I'll see if I can cover it in the next video. Thanks for watching.